From an international relations perspective, securitization is the process of identifying or framing a threat to national security, be it as a threat of law and order or defined in environmental, economic or socio-cultural terms. The implication of framing a phenomenon as a threat, its securitization, entails a response that is more military or police-driven than political and societal. By securitizing an issue, the perception of the threat changes and the scrutiny of the policy also changes. Therefore, leadership is enabled to lead against a threat rather than advocate for a specific vision of society. The 2015 Syrian refugee crisis that was triggered from a rapidly escalating civil war was one of the biggest Europe had witnessed since the wars of Yugoslavia in the 90s, if not the Second World War. The refugee flow was politically divisive. Media responses and political stakeholders largely responded by either raising the spectre of fear and the security implications of the massive refugee flow, or by underlying the humanitarian dimension of the crisis at hand. Between the two sides of the spectrum, there is, of course, ample room for middle off-the-road approaches. But, undeniably, the issue at hand created a political rift, and governments could be seen as handling the problem, reacting to the problem, being overrun by the problem, but not ignoring the problem. Securitization made governments look stronger and decisive, as the response was visible. Whether that response was effective is another question. The humanitarian side of the crisis was not forgotten, but the issue at hand is that politicians are held accountable to the voters, not humanity. One could focus on the security dimension of the refugee challenge by focusing on refugees as entitled to international protection. That means focusing on search and rescue operations, particularly at sea, where in 2015 thousands were losing their lives. Another approach is to see the refugees as a force of nature, likening them to a flood, vermin, invaders, and the like. In that case, the refugees are the danger. The language used to frame the security challenge profoundly affects public opinion and the core values evoked to justify policy choices. Faced with a transnational refugee flow that passed across national borders, the EU proved unable to frame the refugee narrative clearly. Reluctant member states such as Hungary and Poland undermined the possibility of a common immigration policy by focusing on the refugees as the security challenge. In time, every nation-state has a similar political narrative in its political system, dominant or less so. As Judit and Toth discuss, Syrian refugees and asylum seekers were identified as a threat, securitizing the crisis and undermining policies driven by the notion that asylum seekers were entitled to international protection. In time, electoral concerns prevailed over humanitarian instincts across a number of EU member states. Because the EU member states failed to reach a consensus on how to cope with the constant flow of persecuted people from Syria, ensuing common EU policies were undermined and discredited. Hungary, Poland, and gradually others displayed reluctance to sharing the responsibility of hosting and integrating migrants. As this rift emerged, Brussels was portrayed as a distant supranational centre, challenging national sovereignty and national and religious homogeneity. The discourse was implicitly racist, pointing to the otherness of refugees, portraying them as invaders, and Brussels was seen as leading the enemy within. The refugee crisis became the field for a greater battle between two colliding visions of Europe of the nations versus Europe of the people. The former preference is prevalent in Central Eastern Europe and increasingly other EU member states. In the context of the refugee crisis, leaders from Central Eastern Europe challenged the notion that common policies are obligatory for all member states. They contrasted their national resolute action on the borders with less visibly effective policies stemming from Brussels. They called for EU funding to keep the so-called danger outside Europe. The perception of migration as a security concern is now dominant. The alternative is an approach rooted in modern European history and indeed the origins of the project of European integration. Rather than labelling migrants a problem to be solved by the recipient Mediterranean countries, refugees could be seen as a test case of how EU solidarity works in action, or how the EU lives up to its self-portrayal as a normative power and a guarantor of international human rights law. In effect, securitization of refugee flows leads to policies that necessarily violate international law, which prohibits states from returning refugees and asylum seekers to any territory where their lives will be at risk of prosecution. The language of securitization breeds racism and xenophobia. Foreigners are seen as a substance that dilutes an organic nation linked by bonds of blood and spiritual affinity. That language is what the project of European integration was meant to erase. The mobilization of national security forces, internal border controls, and even the emergence of physical barriers portrayed those who exercised power as decisive, silencing those who questioned the meaning and effect of this approach. Combating racism, hate speech and Islamophobia has become one of the priorities of all the organizations involved in protecting vulnerable groups. In the 2015 crisis, securitization discourse soon focused on trafficking, blaming those who facilitate the voyage rather than asylum seekers. This created a paradox. On the one hand, securitization creates a trafficking industry. The Western Balkans route soon became a trafficking market, dealing in hard cash with prices determined by the degree of refugee despair. On the other, a security problem allows states to focus on security solidarity, focusing on border patrols rather than accommodating asylum seekers. As securitization won the battle of public opinion, their focus quickly became how the Western Balkans could be turned from a conduit of migration from the Eastern Mediterranean to Western Europe to a bottleneck. What was ignored is international law that expects states to pay attention to the safe passage of people on the move, thus eliminating any form of exploitation. The conceptualization of refugees as a security challenge is now the new normal in international affairs, as seen in the constant blame game between the EU and Turkey. The joint action plan between the EU and Turkey in 2016 led to refugee entrapment between Greece and Turkey, putting human lives at risk and exposing them to violence, tear gas, hunger and cold. Amid the COVID epidemic, we witnessed similar pictures in the autumn of 2019. The term securitization strategically frames migration policies that prioritize electoral concerns rather than migrants' needs. Political campaign discourse in recent years confirms this perception. The Syrian refugee crisis tested the values and solidarity of the EU profoundly, catching national and EU institutions off guard. It is unclear whether normality has since been restored. The securitization of this refugee crisis is creating a blame game trap focusing on borders. But in making this a border issue, it is unclear whether Europe is effectively preparing for the next crisis.